the first story we have today is something that certainly sounds like something that would come about in the age of Donald Trump, and that is Quad NATO, or the Quad, which is going to be a NATO-like treaty. And it seems to be designed to counter China as the U.S. is looking to involve India, Australia, and Japan. This is a pretty diverse group of nations here, Will, and a pretty bold, style alliance. I mean, NATO is, it has the Article 5, you attack one, you attack them all. That's some big security and defense commitments. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I do think it's interesting to see this quad thing developing. I mean, it was founded back in 2007. I think it was largely a project of Shinzo Abe, the Japanese prime minister, or no longer. I guess he just recently stepped down. But as far as I understand, it was sort of his like brainchild in developing this idea for this Quad alliance. And Dick Cheney at the time too, the vice president at the time, was also like, had a hand in creating it, as you might not be surprised to hear. I thought it was interesting though. I was reading this column recently in a Korean newspaper where it was written in 2008, pretty soon after this thing was founded, and the author was being pretty like critical of this whole project, and he was saying how no one's really has a big interest in being antagonistic toward China now. This thing's probably just going to fade away and disappear. And it kind of looked like it might. Like there was a point where I think Australia had bowed out, where like there was some tension between them and India over uranium sales or something, and it did kind of look like the thing was going to fall apart. But that did not happen. And yeah, like this week, that columnist was like proven more wrong than ever, I guess, because now you do have the State Department saying they would like to formalize this thing into something like a NATO, which right now the Quad is more just like a cooperative mutual defense, or excuse me, a cooperative military forum, I should say. But what they want to make it into is a mutual defense pact, was what it sounds like, where if one member is attacked, then the others will come, go to war in their defense. Kind of that's how the NATO Article 5 thing works. So it sounds like that's sort of the direction they want to take this thing with this Quad. And I have heard this thing referred to before as the Asian NATO, like already. And so I guess they really just want to formalize that like nickname for it.
Right. Well, one of the things that jumps out to me is, of course, the inclusion of India in this. The U.S. already has, I believe, defense pads with both Japan and Australia. Australia, there's I believe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, U.S. treaty that ties them all together, and they do naval drills. And then the U.S. has had like the defense guarantee of Japan from World War II. So, those two exist. But India, the second biggest by population country in the world, what is not, I don't think correctly in the name of democracy, but it's called the world's largest democracy. Right now, it's ruled by a everybody calls him a right-wing fascist. I think in the age of Trump, that doesn't sound like a whole lot of anything, but I think the way I most accurately, I think, see Modi, who is the prime minister, is something like a Netanyahu in Israel, who is very much for his sector. He really goes towards like the Hindu nationalist base, and makes a living off of demonizing the Muslims, but rather in the Kashmir region than the West Bank. And then there's 100 something million Muslims in India as is. I think it's like the actually second or third largest Muslim population country, which is crazy when you could figure the Muslims are like 10% of the population in that country. So to be such a large population but such a minority is huge. And then there's the region of Kashmir and Jammu and the disputed border region along the Himalayas with China. They're just such complicating factors, and it really involved this government and this army in some pretty nasty war crimes, the ongoing occupation of Kashmir, while gets even a fraction of a coverage that the plight of the Palestinians does is significant. And then one of the things that we know about NATO is it guarantees you priority and like the super US weapon sales. If you're a NATO ally, we'll pretty much sell you anything. Maybe not Predator drones to all NATO allies, but I can't imagine what else we really wouldn't sell one of these Patriot missiles, F-35s, Will sell it all if you're a NATO member, and so I would be very concerned about the U.S. getting into deeper ties with India specifically here, and then also that India has so many disputed borders. I mean, the main one we could talk about here is with China, and in fact, within the past day, there were reports of India having to carry out some maneuvers because they say China was trying to take a strategic hill along the border.
Yeah.
Um, so I wonder if there's a mistranslation there, like if they're really going after a hill or if it was, like a mountaintop or something, which is usually the kind of thing that, these two are fighting over, not something as significant as a hill. But, this is what we're talking about here. And the U.S. just seems like, especially in the age of Trump, when there doesn't seem to maybe be as refined foreign policy thinking by the president as there would be, by Obama. I think he had like the ability to ask a little bit more questions about this kind of thing and maybe realize really what he was getting himself into. I think Trump is walking into a real mess right here, and he really probably doesn't get like all the geopolitical problems, including with states that the U.S. is allied with, like Pakistan. So I don't know if you have any other thoughts on this, or if you think it's quite bad of an idea as I do.
Yeah, yeah, I tend to agree. And if you listen to what because I think the specific State Department official, we talked about him on the last show, on the first show, I believe, of conflicts of interest. We talked about the Deputy Secretary of State, Stephen Biegun. And what he was saying too, in addition to saying sort of this is like a move to be they want to create this thing, make this thing into a bulwark against the Chinese. He was also saying that at some point they'd like to expand this thing to include South Korea and Vietnam and New Zealand as well. So they're even talking about like, getting more ambitious with this thing. And yeah, sort of South Korea already serves that for purpose. It's like a huge American, military base there right next to China. However, one thing I was going to point out, and sort of, I'm curious if like I think the current Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, I think he tends to track with the U.S. position on China, which is mostly hostile. And then, of course, as you're mentioning, the India's position on China right now is really sort of things are really heating up between them. You mentioned that border dispute just this week that's kind of escalating again. And back in June, they had like a big clash. I think it was like their biggest clash in decades, where a couple dozen people I think died on both sides, soldiers. I think it was just like a hand-to-hand thing. But so we know for a fact, though, that the Australians and the Indians have a fairly hostile relationship toward China. But something I'm not really aware of is like, do you have an impression of like what the feeling is in Japan toward the Chinese? Like I know they have sort of a history, a rough history that goes back. They haven't always got along, and I don't know. Maybe you don't know. That's fine. But I'm just curious if you get some impression of what their sort of stance would be on this kind of thing.
Yeah, I think Japan would. That's at least under the Abe administration. Now things may change going forward. I know that there is like a real contingent in Japan of people for like the peace-ish movement and stuff like that, and so I hope it would go that direction, and that maybe the incoming prime minister is going to really, kind of push to undo some of the stuff that Abe has done. But Japan's in like kind of a complicated situation because after World War II, the U.S. forced them to accept like a peace constitution, and so essentially they didn't have a military at all and were dependent on the U.S. for defense. Even up until very recently, a lot of people might not realize this. Japan was the world's second largest economy, and so this is a massive booming economy. But at the same time, they have absolutely no defense, and then China's a massive and growing economy and is now larger than Japan, I guess. There's you can imagine how that would work among the American populace, right? If there was this country right next door that got really 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 big and economically powerful, and then was building up a military deterrent against your ally. I guess it made sense to me that there's a lot of angst in Japan and feeling of like we have to be able to deter the Chinese. And then there are disputes. So one of the interesting things I was going to point out is that when you initially talk about this Quad NATO alliance thing, India has land disputes with China, but I don't think has any maritime boundary disputes with China, and neither does Australia, where Japan has a couple, but not. It's not like with Vietnam or the Philippines or
Right,
Malaysia,
Malaysia.
where there's
Yeah.
significant, maritime boundary differences, and that on the last episode of the show we're talking about all this conflict in the South China Sea, and then Taiwan claims a whole bunch of this territory too, which complicates the hell out of things. Um, yeah, so my sense would be is that Japan would be like one of the drivers of this. Although again, with the like recent tensions with India, I'm sure they're more willing than ever to get involved here. And I don't know. I thought that was one of the other really interesting things about this proposed alliance was just is this just a naval thing? Because in a sense, it seems like that's where all the coordination is between these countries. But at the same time, at least when it comes to India, a land conflict is far, far more likely than a naval one. And so I guess I have a feeling that India wouldn't just commit to like coming to the aid in a naval conflict because it's unlikely that they would get in a naval conflict with China, and then would also expect the U.S. and all U.S., Australia, and Japan to enter into a war with China should India feel like China invaded India. And I mean, the way these borders work and everything, China could claim to be on Chinese territory while India says that they've invaded India by 50 miles in some places.
Right,
And
right.
so I think it's a very dangerous thing. But again, one of the reasons I thought it was really important to talk about this is it seems to me like the kind of thing that might appeal to Donald Trump. I think it's going to work for weapon sales. I think he's going to get like a big, celebratory thing out of it. I'm
Right,
sure
big
it will.
deal. Yeah.
Right. I'm sure that the to the people who feel like, oh, maybe Donald Trump's a little bit of a racist if he's up there holding hands with whoever the Japanese prime minister is and Modi, well, that's kind of a, good diverse image look that he has, and shaking hands, like having the crown prince or whoever from Dubai, MBZ, having him sign a deal with the Israelis. It makes it seem like Trump, probably isn't that much of a bigot if he's able to like work out a deal with all these people. So I think, all those things are kind of going to go into this. And I know Modi is heavy on flattery of Trump, and like he seems to be one of these guys, kind of like who's the prime minister of Poland or the president of Poland who's like, we'll build Fort Trump, right? Like,
Right.
they kind of get that if you roll out the red carpet, and Modi had this massive rally for Trump, even as the coronavirus thing was getting going,
Yeah.
to celebrate Trump coming to the country. And it was like 100% about Trump, Netanyahu putting up billboards with him and Trump shaking hands. I think all of this is to flatter the president's ego. And I might work a little bit, which is the concerning part of me. So, and
Right.
and again,
And
and
easily moved.
and then the other thing about it too is, I think this is kind of where we're at with not only Trump but the whole U.S. populace in general. Quad NATO sounds kind of cool. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It sounds like Sharknado or something that you would see on TV these days. And I think people are just dying to like tweet something out and have a nice catchy hashtag. So I think we're gonna be talking about this into the future. Well, I don't think this is the last time. And if the U.S. starts selling these countries, especially India, a whole bunch of advanced weapons, I think China's gonna take notice. I right, interesting report from the Pentagon saying that they believe China to have in the low number of 200s of nuclear weapons, but that they're expecting China to double those nuclear warheads over the next 10 years. A couple, parts about that story that are particularly interesting is that if China has in the low 200s of nukes, which I would guess is under what, 225, 230, then they have about 100 less nukes than everybody assessed them to have. The number's long been over 300 at about 320 to 350. And so, and the Pentagon didn't give a hard number on what doubling meant. And so, if it's in the low 200s, and the Pentagon saying they're going to go to 400, that's really not much of a bump over the 320 nukes that everybody was fine with China having before. but the way
Right.
all the stories are written are very sensational, and I think it's going to at the if you see a story about, hey, we're coming up with this possibly new NATO ideal to combat China, and then you see next China's going to double their nuclear arsenal, you think, oh my god. Well, China's nuclear arsenal is a 20th of just the United States. They possess like 2% or 3% of the world's nuclear weapons. And yeah, it's presented like they have this massive growing nuclear arsenal that must be combated. And hell, we got this Quad NATO thing right here that we could roll out for everybody. So
Right.
yeah, there's a lot going on here. Will, do you have anything else on it?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, just to piggyback on something you said, I do wonder if the stuff they're rolling out about the Chinese doubling their nuclear arsenal and stuff, I wonder if they're trying to kind of prime the pump, because as we recently talked about on our previous show, Foreign Policy Focus, um, the U.S. position has now changed on the New START deal, where before they were trying to force the Chinese into this agreement to sort of limit their nuclear arsenal, and now they're saying that they're going to try to negotiate a separate arms control deal with the Chinese. So I wonder if they're kind of like, putting together their position to say the Chinese are doubling their arsenal, and they're just trying to like assemble this argument that, I don't know, maybe they're priming the pump for that. So that'd be my last thought on the Quad NATO deal.
Yeah, that's a good point. When the propaganda has dual meanings, it's very effective, I'm sure.
Yeah.